MSU Extension is the educational outreach arm of Michigan State University. We are organized under federal legislation, the Smith-Lever Act of 1914, which basically says that there will be an extension office in every county of every state and territory in the United States. So whether you're here in Macomb, up in Gogebic, or in a county in Oregon, if you look under the local county government in the phone book, you will find a cooperative extension service. And the second thing that the Smith-Lever Act says is the partnership. It is a partnership between the federal, state, and local governments. So we receive funding through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We also are a line item in the state of Michigan's budget, and we get funding from the counties, and that is either through a direct millage, which some of the counties have, or an MOA, Memorandum of Agreement, which says they support extension and are willing to invest dollars to provide programs such as this to you. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Claire Lehman with MSU Extension.
Hello, welcome. I am really impressed by the turnout here. I'm Claire Bodie. I had a name change recently. I got married, so I changed my name to Bodie. Yeah, I drove on the roads here from Grand Rapids, and I'm sure that we can all agree that the roads are a mess, right? It's spring, it's pothole season. Some are better than others, but in general, that's something that everyone in Michigan agrees on, is the road needs fixing. How we do that is really a matter of contention. So I'm just going to give just a real brief background on how we got here, and then some highlights of Proposal 1, and then Bill Anderson from Southeast Michigan Council of Governments will do a deeper dive into road funding, and then, as Terry mentioned, Nicole Bradshaw from Citizens Research Council will go into more detail about Proposal 1. It is complicated, so if you hear something from me and then you hear it again from Bill and then from Nicole, that's good, because I've been studying this for a couple months and it's still complicated. So we have a structural funding problem with how we fix and maintain our roads and bridges and transportation infrastructure. And again, that is something that almost everyone, all policymakers agree on. So currently, the money that we get to fund roads comes from two main sources. One is vehicle registration fees, and the other is a tax levied at the pump, the state gas tax. Now it gets complicated because there's two other taxes levied at the pump as well. There's a federal gas tax on top of that, and there's also a state sales tax, okay? But the one tax that we use for funding the roads is the state gas tax. The last time that was raised was in 1996, and it went into effect in 1997. So we have a problem in that the 1997 money is a lot different than 2015, right? Inflation makes it, our money not go as far. Another problem is if we're funding our roads based a lot on how much we pay at the pump, then that doesn't take into account driving fewer miles, which actually has happened with telecommuting. We're actually driving fewer miles, and also increased fuel efficiency with cars. So the fuel efficiency has actually been going up, which means we're spending less money on gasoline at the pump, which means there's less revenue and money to go into fixing the roads. Then this is compounded by the fact that as the roads get worse and we don't have enough money to fix them, the roads get worse, and then it takes more money to fix them. So the longer we wait, the more expensive it gets to fix them. And as a result, we also have this debt now, about $2 million for past road projects that we've embarked upon. Billion, I'm sorry. Thank you for that correction. $2 billion, right. So all of this adds up to, as I said, a structural funding problem. Okay, so Proposal 1, the purpose of the Proposal 1 is to provide a long-term solution to road funding by changing the way fuel is taxed so that taxes paid at the pump are directed to transportation. So as I mentioned, there are three different taxes we pay: per gallon at the pump, and only one of those goes towards transportation. The state sales tax is directed to, in part, to local governments, the school aid fund, and other general government things. So a lot of people say, well, I don't want to raise my taxes at the pump. I don't want to just raise the gas tax because we already have a high fuel burden in Michigan. We're already, I think, fifth in the country in terms of the amount of taxes paid at the pump. So how do we fix this without causing, without shorting local governments, the state's general fund, and education? So that's the purpose of Proposal 1. In just a bit more detail, these are the bullet points. These are the main components of Proposal 1. So it would eliminate the sales tax on motor fuels. As I said, we currently pay a 6% sales tax on top of the 19 cents a gallon state tax on top of a federal tax. So this would take that sales tax out, and we would no longer pay that sales tax at the pump. But that leaves a shortage because that revenue, as I said, funds other things like local governments and schools. So then we have to increase the sales tax on non-fuel goods from 6 to 7%. That's the proposal. So then the third bullet point is direct a portion of the use tax revenue to the school aid fund. Do you guys know what the use tax is? Yeah, I know. I didn't know about this either until I was researching another issue. It's basically, it's the same thing as the sales tax. It's 6%, but it's paid on things that they don't collect sales tax money on. So, for example, internet and catalog purchases. If you're not taxed on that, if you don't pay tax, you are supposed to then send in 6% of that to the state government. You're supposed to. And some people do. And then there's also a use tax levied on hotel rooms, on the sale of cars, sale of vehicles and motorcraft. So it is a percentage of the revenue that we get. So there would so the proposal would take another portion of that use tax and put it in the school aid fund, again, to make up for some of the shortfall. Then the next thing also doesn't have to do with roads, but it's another of these ripple effects things. Increase the earned income tax credit from 6% to 20% of the federal EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit. Nicole will talk about the purpose of that. Okay, change the current 19 cents per gallon gas tax. Remember I mentioned that's that state tax, to an annually adjusted rate based on 14.9% of the average wholesale price of gas. So basically we're changing the way that we tax gasoline. Instead of paying it at the pump, and as you know, the price of gas fluctuates quite a bit. And remember I mentioned that with increased fuel standards and and other issues, that's a less predictable source of income or revenue. So this would be charged on the wholesale price of gasoline. And then direct some of the new transportation revenue that's created by increasing the sales tax from 6 to 7%, which we're now paying on everything else but motor fuels, to pay down some of the debt. Remember I mentioned we're $2 billion in debt over the next 2 years. Okay, so those are the main components. This is the official ballot language, and we have it also in written form for you, so you don't have to memorize it here. But I wanted you to see, it's pretty long, okay? And it's pretty complicated. So, with that, Bill Anderson from Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. It's yours.
What I'm going to do is first go through background in terms of what we are dealing with in the state of Michigan in terms of dealing with transportation funding. Before you see a list of the miles of roads, the top states in the nation in terms of how many miles of roads there are in each state. So as you can see, Michigan is 9th in the country with about 122,000 miles of roads to deal with. Now, to put that into a little perspective, if you just drove up and down each road, in order to drive that distance, that's the same distance as driving to the moon, about 250,000 miles. Texas, obviously, is well ahead of Michigan with over 300,000, California at 172. But for the most part, there's no other state in the nation that has significantly more roads than Michigan. I'm going to point out Ohio on this slide. A lot of people like to compare Michigan with Ohio in terms of the quality of roads. If you look at this, essentially, Michigan and Ohio have exactly the same amount of roads to deal with. Ohio has a lot more people to pay for those roads. And Ohio, whereas Michigan is collecting about $2 billion a year to take care of our roads, Ohio is collecting about $3 billion a year to essentially maintain the same amount of roads as Michigan. So to put it into perspective, compare Ohio roads to Michigan roads. Now, we were talking about revenue coming in from the state. Now, obviously, the main revenue source in Michigan comes from those two taxes we were talking about, the gas tax and the registration fees. The third leg on this stool is the federal government. And if you want to put perspective on it, think $1 billion each. $1 billion from the gas tax, $1 billion from registration fees, and $1 billion from the federal government coming in. So where is the revenue coming in from the state? What's the history that we have here? Here's the last 14 years in terms of the revenues that have come in to take care of the roads. This is the money that the state keeps to run those programs on the interstates, the U.S. roads, the M roads. This is the money that's distributed to the county road commissions that takes care of all the roads in the townships and some of the roads in the cities. And this is the money that goes to the cities and villages to take care of those roads as well. As you can see on this chart, we've seen in the last 14 years a change from $1.91 billion to $1.95 billion. A 2% change over 14 years. During that time, things like cost of asphalt has gone up, what, about 70%? Steel for all those culverts, probably another 50%. I don't even want to know what salt costs were last year. Cost of gasoline to put in the vehicles to plow the roads has gone up. Essentially, what's happened is over the last 14 years, you've seen more and more money going into the basic services, things like plowing the roads, and less money available to actually do the maintenance that we need to. And when we do have money going into it, the cost of doing those projects has gone up significantly. So again, these are all the numbers in terms of how much money is being collected off of those two taxes in this state. Now, in the SEMCOG region, SEMCOG represents the 7-county metropolitan Detroit area: Wayne, Oakley, Macomb, St. Clair, Monroe, Washtenaw, and Livingston. We have 22,000 miles of roads in those 7 counties. Now, within that, all roads have different classifications in terms of how much money they're going to receive from the state for the operation of those roads. Now, within that 22,000, there's about 8,000 miles of road that are classified as eligible for federal aid. That means of that $1 billion that comes in from the federal government, it cannot be used on any other roads except for those 8,000 miles, okay? Now, we pay special attention to those roads. Back in 2002, the legislature decided that we had to go in and create an asset management program. And what that means is that everywhere in this state, you have to go out and evaluate the condition of those roads that are eligible for federal aid. So each year, SEMCOG partners up with the county road commissions and with the State Department of Transportation to evaluate the condition of those roads. And each year we do about half of it. So we go out and we look at about 4,000 miles of road, and we actually grade them out, 1 to 10. 10 being the top, 1 being the bottom. When we get all done with it, we put those in and group them into categories: good, fair, and poor. Good roads means it's probably been repaved lately. And what you need to do is just basic maintenance to keep that road in good condition. Fair means it's starting to show signs of wear. Cracks are starting to develop. You might see some potholes. You might see some swales. You might see some cracking off the edges. But what it does mean, when a road is hit fair condition, now you better start working that road if you want to protect the asset that you have. It's just like when you got a roof. If the roof is starting to go, you better go and do some work. Otherwise, it's going to go quicker. In asset management, you focus on the roads that are starting to go, because you can do things to those roads for a lot less money than it costs if you let them go into poor condition. Once you hit poor condition, it means it's time to replace the road. It means pull it up and put down a new road. So where are we? In 2004, we graded out that 10% of the roads within the SEMCOG region, that 7-county region, were in poor condition, essentially saying, you know what, this road needs to be replaced. 73% was in that middle category, roads that you needed to take care of. Now, it might mean that you're doing crack sealing, it might mean you're doing chip coating, it might mean that you're laying down 2 inches of asphalt just to put a top coat over the top of it, knowing that if you do that, it might give you an extra year, it might give you an extra 5 years, it might give you an extra 10 years on the life of that road. And at that time, 17% of the roads were in good condition. Now, I will tell you about that time. We had just gotten done with something called Build 1, Build Michigan 1, Build Michigan 2, Build Michigan 3. Back earlier than that, the state decided to help the economy. We were going to put a lot of money into roads and borrow money for it. One thing that I think we do know about roads is they wear out on a regular basis. And when you borrow money and pay for it, but then you don't have any money later on, it doesn't help. So when we talk about the $2 billion that's in bonds at the state, that was from those programs where we borrowed money and said, we're going to make jobs and we're going to put asphalt down. And then we didn't have money because $200 million a year out of that $2 billion is just going back to pay off the roads that we paved 15 years ago. And it's not helping today. So where were we at last summer? We went out last summer. Same roads that we evaluated in 2004. Now, instead of 10%, there's 43% are now in poor condition. What happened over that period of time is all this time we've been talking that you need more money for the roads to do the proper maintenance for all those miles of roads that have to be maintained. That money was not going into those maintenance programs, so those roads were just getting older. The cracks developed, the water gets in, it freezes, it pushes up, and when it thaws, it collapses under into potholes, and that just breeds even worse roads. Even more concerning, or disconcerting, is the fact of the 43% that are fair, a really large chunk of those are just barely fair. So when we go into our computer modeling, given the current money that we have and the current way it is being spent, we see that as soon as 2020, we could see 3/4 of the major roads, the mile roads, the M roads, the interstates, falling into poor condition. And you want to know something? These are the roads that get most of the money that are in the best shape. This doesn't include the subdivision road you live on. We don't actually go in and measure those. But then again, those are the roads that don't get a whole lot of money. These are the roads that you drive to get to work every day. So, let's Let's review how we handle this stuff right now. Gasoline tax brings in about $800 million a year on gasoline. That 19 cents a gallon. 1997, we charged 19 cents a gallon to pay for roads. Back then, you could have bought a gallon of gasoline for about $1.50. A year ago, when gasoline was $3.50, you paid 19 cents a gallon for the roads you drive on. Today, at $2.49, according to the gas stations along the road, it's 19 cents a gallon going to pay for roads. The diesel tax is at a different rate, but it also brings in about $129 million a year. So between the two, I go back to my earlier statement, about $1 billion comes in off of the motor vehicle fuel tax. Registrations, $905 million. Again, this is the amount that you pay when you register your car and get your tabs every year. What's it based on? The original sales price of your car. Each year right now, after you've owned your car for a year, your next registration fee will be deducted. A 10% depreciation is taken off. That happens for 3 years. So it goes from 100% to 90 to 81 to 72% of the vehicle cost. Then after that, it's frozen at that amount. That's the way that those fees are figured right now. And again, it's a percentage of the assumed retail cost. They don't go out and look how much you paid for it. It's basically they look it up by vehicle and use the manufacturer suggested price. All right. Now, I've talked about this. We talked about earlier, one of the big problems on why we're not seeing growth is because this amount is frozen. There's no changes for inflation, there's no changes for the cost of gasoline, and there's no changes for the fact that maybe we drive just a little bit, and more importantly, we actually consume less fuel per person than we used to because your car is getting a better mileage than it used to 15 years ago. And it's probably going to do even more as we go on. So, I've talked about the depreciation and commercial vehicle fees assessed based on weight. So when you have a commercial vehicle, it's based on the weight of the vehicle instead of the value of the vehicle. And yes, there is the issue, as the gentleman pointed out next to me, that we do have an issue in this state that we have trucks that are heavier than trucks found anywhere else in the country. Is it every truck? No. It is a small percentage of the trucks, but most states have an 80,000-pound weight limit. We go to 160,000, and if you look at it, start counting the number of axles, because when you do run at 160,000, you have to run with a lot more axles than you do at 80. And the other thing is, when you own a truck like that, you can't take it out of state. Well, you can, but you got to run it half loaded. This is a significant issue, especially further up north where you're hauling a lot of timber. So let's take a look at a gallon of gasoline. I use $3.18 because it's easy to show in this particular example. Here are the taxes that you pay when you buy a gallon of gas at $3.18. First of all, you pay the federal gas tax, which is 18.4 cents per gallon. We have the same problem with the federal gas tax that we have with the state gas tax. It hasn't been increased for nearly 2 decades, and it's set on a specific amount of cents per gallon, which means it also has been fairly well frozen. Now, people will say, how come Michigan isn't getting back all of its taxes it sends to Washington, back to our roads? The answer is, we do. Everybody does. Every state in this nation gets back at least the amount of money that is collected in the state from the gas tax. I said at least, because there are many states, most states, get more than what they send in. The federal government takes their general operational budget and subsidizes that. The problem is that funding runs out at the end of May. So while I can say we get back everything we send, we also are among the bottom states in terms of the percentage that we get back at only 100%, because there's a lot of states that get a lot more than 100% back. But you got to understand, in some states, if they only got back what they got, they'd only have one road running through their state. So then you have the state gas tax, 19 cents a gallon in this particular case. So you can see when I talk about $1 billion and $1 billion, there's the state gas tax, federal gas tax, they're virtually the same. They bring in about the same amount of money. Now, in this particular case, at $3.18 a gallon, that meant that we sold the gasoline at $3. And sales tax on $3 is 18 cents, essentially the same amount of money that you saw in the federal gas tax and the state gas tax. But here's the kicker. Whereas the federal gas tax and the state gas tax all go back to the roads, I will say none. There's a little tiny asterisk. There's a little tiny amount of that money goes to roads. But no, sales taxes do not go to pay for roads. So yes, Michigan, when gas was at about $3.50 a gallon, we had one of the highest rates for taxes on gasoline. But half of that money, half of that tax, was not going back to roads. It was going to places where we, the citizens, said it shall go because we put in things in the Constitution that says where the sales tax must go. And that's going to be a big issue here in a minute. Yeah, hold on. We're going to talk about this in a second. So in this particular case, they're all the same. Now, the problem is, if I cut this chart back down to $2.12, that 18 cents sales tax now becomes 12 cents sales tax. And actually, Michigan moves from the fourth highest tax on gasoline to about middle of the road for all states in the country because the tax just disappeared because we're charging a smaller rate. But when you look at how much of the tax is going to roads, we are actually on the low side of the amount of taxes that we collect for roads. And in fact, our state, over the last 20 years, has consistently been at the bottom of the barrel in how much we spend on our roads on a per capita basis in the nation. I think our roads kind of show it. Now, what I'm going to do is take a look at where does the sales tax go? See, I get there. I get there. All right. According to the Constitution of our state, we actually have two separate sales taxes. We have the original 4 cents that we had been paying since the 30s, and then we added 2 cents when Proposal A passed in 1994. So we have 6 cents. All of the money associated with Proposal A in the sales tax is dedicated to schools, 100%. The original 4 cents that we had was split up constitutionally for 60% goes to schools and 15% is returned back to cities, villages, and townships on a per capita basis called constitutional revenue sharing. So under that, it means for the total gas tax, 75 cents on the dollar goes to schools, and about 10 cents of all of that dollar goes back to fund where we are sitting right now. The other 15 cents goes to the state. 10 years ago, I would have told you that goes back to the counties, to the villages, cities, and townships through something called statutory revenue sharing, but a good chunk of that money has disappeared back into the state budget. So at this point, about 15% is going to the state general fund, 10% is going back to the cities, villages, and townships in revenue sharing, 75% is going back to the schools. The issue is when you take the sales tax off of gasoline, it creates a $1 billion gap in these categories, whether it be the schools, the municipalities, or in this case also, part of it going to the state. So when everybody started talking about, well, let's just make sure all the money that we collect on taxes goes to the roads, the problem is we have a constitution that says if you're charging a sales tax, no, the citizens of the state say that has to go to these purposes. So here's the problem. A lot of politicians said we're going to make sure all the money on the gas that is taxed will go to the roads. And all we have to do is amend the Constitution to figure out how to achieve that without creating a $1 billion hole somewhere else. So when you heard all the elements of what is involved, it all gets down to somebody making a very simple statement followed up with a very complicated answer to the statement. There are good parts of all this. The Constitution also says when you collect a tax on gasoline or diesel fuel, the Constitution says it must be used for transportation purposes. That is part of the Constitution, and the only way that gets changed is going through this same exercise of asking the people for a change. That's good, and it has been good for the last half century, that number one, when we have all the politics in Lansing about where money should go, none of it was involving how much money should go into transportation. They simply said, here's how much you collected, here's how much you spent. And when it comes to transportation, that's a good thing. Because I'll give you a hint. You don't figure out your road projects today for the projects you're going to start next week. It takes years to figure out what projects you're going to do, figure out the schedules, and start putting it into place. So it is extremely important to have a known quantity of appropriations so that you can start figuring out the best way to use that money and to set up your program to have it in place. Because for as long as it takes to actually construct a road, it probably takes 3 times that much to get things like federal approvals, EPA approvals, and to go through the process to get that road ready for construction. So this is just the background of what led up to the discussion. All right, so now what we're going to do is start talking about the specifics of the proposal. And by the way, if you noticed my name, Bill Anderson, more importantly, the website, semcog.org. We have pages set up on our website that lists out all these issues. For instance, you can see on that website the specific amount that is going to the Macomb County Road Commission today and what they would receive under the ballot proposal, the amount that they receive on average per mile of road, how many miles of roads they're responsible for. Every municipality in the county is listed on there and how much they're going to get. We have interactive maps so you can pull up your community to see the grading on all the roads, whether it's good, fair, or poor. And you can look at your community, and we actually show what they were in 2004, 2009, 2014, and we actually have a poll question on there. Are you going to support or not support the ballot proposal? And if you don't support this proposal, what do you think should be done? And we give you several different options in terms of what you think should be done. One of the greatest challenges under this is I will bet you I can come up with lots of different answers about what all of you think should be done.
Going to have to bring this lid down a little bit. We're going to leave all questions till the end. So good afternoon, everyone. And again, I just want to reiterate what Claire said earlier. I am very impressed with the turnout and the passion. This is a very passionate issue. We're talking about roads, which we all have to deal with. We all have to deal with today here. And we're talking about taxes. So I understand the level of passion. As the third speaker up here tonight, or this afternoon, it turns out I'm going to say a lot of the same things that I already said, but I'm going to say them in a different way with a little bit of a different focus. I'm going to try not to belabor any issues that have already been discussed, but this is an educational session, so that is the role I'm going to play. Just a little bit about my organization. My name is Nicole Bradshaw. I'm a research associate with the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. We are a 99-year-old public policy research firm, and like MSU Extension, we are nonpartisan. We always do an analysis of every ballot proposal that is on the statewide ballot. We do not ever take sides on issues. Our goal is to provide you with a nonpartisan, objective, and independent analysis. And so that is what I'm going to present you with today. So I'm definitely hearing that we all think that this is complicated, maybe overly so. I've been intentionally ignoring all the commercials and radio ads. But I know that they're generating a lot of confusion, contradicting each other on the yes and the no side. I'm here to assure you that this is indeed very complicated. It is a complex matter, and there's a lot of reasons for it. I'm going to touch on 2 reasons and try to explain the process, and then I'm going to go into more detail about the entire proposal. So part of the reason why Proposal 15-1 is very complicated is because it's just one part of an entire transportation funding package. And this entire package contains both constitutional components, changes to the Constitution, as well as some statutory or law changes, things that can be passed by the legislature. Now, to start all this, the reason why this came to be is that the legislature last session, this ended up happening in December of 2014. We're trying to address multiple goals. First, their goal was to increase funding for roads and bridges. To do that, they wanted to, secondly, make sure that all taxes paid at the pump went to roads. Bill touched on this. However, because we're taking that resulted in taking the sales tax out of fuel, what's the prices that are paid at the pump, this created revenue problems in other areas, namely schools and local governments would not get money, and they wanted to hold everyone harmless. In order to fund transportation, they wanted to try to hold everyone harmless. Another one of their goals is to avoid large increases at the pump. Large can mean anything, so we'll take that as we want. And to the extent that sales taxes or other taxes were used to help fund roads or increase taxes to do this, they wanted to be able to provide tax relief to low-income individuals and families. So I think you guys all have the ballot language in front of you. And it was long. First time I did this presentation, I read it. That was super boring. I'm not going to do that again. But you'll see that the main bullet points don't really touch on funding, on road funding. This is part of the confusion, is why don't they? But you will see it in 2 places in that short ballot summary. What you'll see when you go to vote on May 5th, or if you turn in your absentee ballot, is that in 2 places it says that the Proposal 15-1 will give effect to laws. It says this, what I have highlighted in blue. And what that means is that this proposal is tie-barred or linked to other legislative changes. So there's a whole set of laws that in December of 2014, when the legislature decided to put Proposal 15-1 on the May ballot, they also passed 9 other laws that were signed by the governor and are enacted, but they're not in effect. So there's a whole transportation funding package going on here. Now, the components of this entire package that change the Constitution, by law, they require our vote. So those are the bullet points that you see itemized on the ballot. Those are things that require our vote. Those things do not really touch on transportation funding because transportation funding is not, the components of transportation funding that are being changed are not in the Constitution. But there's several statutes that are linked to this where if Proposal 15-1 passes, within the language of the law, they will go into effect if Proposal 15-1 passes. If Proposal 15-1 does not pass, then these legislative changes will not go into effect. So just to be clear, the transportation funding package that I'm referring to includes all of these components. There's the constitutional component, which is what's included in Proposal 15-1, and then there are about 9 or so public acts, laws that have been passed and signed by the governor that will go into effect only if Proposal 15-1 passes. So within these 15, or within this whole package is what includes all the transportation funding, everything that we're talking about, even though you might not see it on the ballot. So with that, I think it makes a lot more sense for me to just talk about the entire transportation funding package rather than just what's included in the proposal. Because if the proposal passes, the whole thing passes. Hopefully I made that part clear. So the transportation funding package basically has three different types of changes. First, as was discussed, we're increasing funding for roads and for transportation. The second category of change is we want to restore funding to any state funds that are negatively harmed. And we've already discussed that this includes schools, local governments, and the state's general fund. And then there's sort of this other category of changes, which is some language to help ensure accountability for the new funding and also to help those who are most impacted by changes to the taxes. So I'm just going to go through these three categories and then move on to the financial impacts. So as was already said, in terms of changes to road and transportation funding, we're exempting fuel from the sales tax. So that's going to end up, that change by itself is going to decrease the pump price. But we know that's not necessarily the case, that pump prices will go down because we're also increasing the fuel tax. So right now we have 19 cents a gallon for gasoline, 15 cents a gallon for diesel. And the proposed change contained in statute is a formula that is 14.9% of the previous year's, approximately previous year's, price of each fuel. And the calculation for us has already been done for the next year because whatever cent per gallon amount that calculates to, it's that amount of cents per gallon for the whole fiscal year. So if this passes, on October 1st, 2015, through September 30th, 2016, the price of the fuel tax at the pump will be 41 cents per gallon for gasoline and 46.4 cents per gallon for diesel. Now, within that new fuel tax formula, there's a ceiling and a floor, meaning that the fuel tax, it's calculated, but it can never get lower than a certain amount, and it can never get go higher than a certain amount. Now, the purpose of this is to ensure that, unlike the current tax, that we have some inflationary increases so that the fuel tax is generating relatively similar amount of revenues as the rise in inflation or the rise in the cost to maintain our roads is sort of the idea. But the fuel formula is based on the price of gasoline as well as inflation. So this could go really high if gas prices skyrocket. However, built into the statute is a ceiling that says that from one year to the next, the price per gallon of gasoline, the tax on a gallon of gasoline can never go up by more than 5 cents. So this is capped from year to year. And it can also never go down from the previous year's price floor. So the price floor set in statute for this year is 41.7 cents a gallon for gasoline. So we'll never see a per gallon fuel tax less than that. So the other change to increase road funding that I won't talk about too much because both Bill and Claire already talked about this, is that they're making some changes to vehicle registration to increase revenues. They're eliminating the depreciation discount that we all see. They're also adding a new registration tax surcharge for vehicles that are powered partially, predominantly, or fully by electricity, and also for very large commercial vehicles, they're increasing the registration tax on those. So then there's another set of changes. And just before I continue, I just want to mention that there's a reason why some of my numbers are purple and why some of them are black. The ones in purple are changes to the Constitution. So I don't want to belabor those points because, like I said, it's the whole package. But if you're curious which changes are making changes to Constitution, which ones are statutory changes, that's why there's a difference in color. So purple is constitutional. So the first constitutional change in an effort to restore funding that was basically eliminated through exempting the fuel from the sales tax is that we're increasing the sales tax from 6% to 7%. And then in statute, we're also doing the same thing to the use tax, which Claire talked about. And then some of the sales tax right now, as Bill talked about, the sales tax in the Constitution is divided up, it's sort of thought about in a 2% and a 4% portion. And so some of this next language is just updating that 4% portion to 5% to account for this new percentage point in sales tax. So right now, 15% of the sales tax, 15% of the 4% rate of the sales tax goes to townships and cities and villages, and that's going to be updated to 5%. So it's going to be 15% of the 5% rate. Clear, right? And then similarly, 60% of the 5% rate will now go to the school aid fund. Right now it's 60% of the 4% rate. So the proportion going to the certain, to local governments and the proportion going to the school aid fund is going to stay the same, and they're going to benefit from the extra percentage point is what this comes down to. And then there's going to be new monies going to being allocated to the school aid from the use tax that wasn't there before. So 12.3% of the use tax revenue at a rate collected at 5% will now go to the school aid fund. So, and I'll talk about I'll sort of talk about how much money that will now raise for schools and local governments in a few slides. So other changes, they're modifying the allowable uses for the school aid fund. Right now, school aid fund predominantly funds K-12 education, community colleges, and some of it's going to four-year universities. So one of the constitutional changes is that's included under this transportation funding package is that the school aid fund can no longer fund higher education, but it can continue to fund community colleges as well as some new career and technical education programs and things like that. So those are new definitions being added to the Constitution. And then also in order to ensure accountability and efficiency of the new road money, there's some language to ensure competitive bidding for new road construction and maintenance projects. And then, as was already sort of mentioned, that when there's an increase in the sales tax, those taxes disproportionately harm low-income individuals and families. So the legislature wanted to include components into this package to help mediate those impacts. So that includes an increase in the state's earned income tax credit, as well as an increase in the homestead property tax credit for very low income seniors and disabled homeowners. Okay, so what it all comes down to, you guys are all interested in what's the out of pocket here. So from the state's perspective, the state's pockets, changes from the sales tax, we're gonna lose about $700 million by exempting the motor fuel from the sales tax. But by increasing the sales tax from 6% to 7%, we're going to increase revenues by $1.5 billion. So this is a net increase of $800 million in sales tax revenue. This $800 million does not yet go to roads. We're still talking about money that is constitutionally, for the most part, constitutionally dedicated to schools, local governments, and the state's general fund. So now what about changes to transportation taxes? So we're seeing an increase in the fuel tax. That's going to bring in about $1.25 billion, $30 million from increases in the state or in the registration taxes. And this is a total increase, net increase of about $1.3 billion going to transportation, mostly roads. It's going to be distributed along the same formula that's used right now. One thing I want to note that's unrelated to this ballot proposal is that currently, as Claire and Bill mentioned, the taxes currently collected for roads are not bringing enough money to maintain our roads. So that funding is currently being subsidized by the general fund. And in the governor's proposed ballot or proposed budget for the next 2 fiscal years, he reduces and eventually eliminates that general fund subsidy for roads. And you know, I don't have a crystal ball, but we can't, there's no reason to believe that that is dependent on passage or not passage of Proposal 15.1. So if the general fund does discontinue subsidizing roads, then the net increase, so we would still have a net increase in taxes of $1.3 billion, but the overall increase in road taxes would only be about $800 million if we lose that general fund subsidy. Okay, so what about for us? What about for Michigan's residents? So there are some benefits. If you're eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit, you'll see 3 times a higher credit there. Same with if you qualify as a very low-income senior, disabled homeowner, you'll see an increase in your homestead property tax. And then there are unknown savings. We didn't try to quantify these from improved road conditions, but we're talking less car maintenance, less wear and tear on your car in general, safety stuff. I don't know what that would be for each of you individually. But we know that there are costs associated with this. If Proposal 15-1 passes, everything that you buy that's subject to the sales tax will now cost 1% more. So right now and in the future, food and prescription drugs are not subject to the sales tax. That won't change. If this passes, fuel won't be. But everything else will cost 1% more because of the increase in the sales tax. Registration taxes will be higher than they would under the current scenario after the first year of registration. And then gasoline and fuel prices will probably be higher. And this is sort of similar to, Bill was talking about this toward the end of his presentation, but I just have a little different way to look at this. And this table is just to show that as gas prices increase, the difference between what we would currently pay and what we would pay under the proposal shrinks. So these first 2 columns are indicative of the prices we're paying right now at the pump, where the final pump price is about $2.40, $2.50 a gallon. And you can see that regardless of whether or not we pass Proposal 15-1, federal gasoline tax stays the same. But we would lose the state sales tax under the proposal, and then the state fuel tax would increase. But what this ends up turning out to be is about 10 cents more per gallon than what we're paying now at current fuel prices. So I sure hope that by December or September 30th, 2016, when these state fuel taxes would go into be in effect if Proposal 15-1 passes, we don't get to $3.80 a gallon. But if we do, you can see here that based on when everything calculates itself out, if gas gets to be $3.80 a gallon, we're only going to be paying 2 cents more under the proposal compared to current. So whether or not that's worth it to you for the increased road funding is obviously your decision, but it's maybe not as extreme as people might expect. And then there's somewhere around $4.20 a gallon where the trend actually reverses and we start to save money. And again, I hope that we don't have gas prices that high, because the fact that we're paying less in fuel tax is not really going to make anyone feel better. But no, it wouldn't. So that's part of the tax floor and tax ceiling. And we can talk about, save that question for the end, actually, because that's a good question. Write that down. Okay, so this is just to conclude here. What if Proposal 15-1 fails? I just want to make clear that none of these changes will go into effect, even though there are laws that have already been passed. Nothing will go into effect that I've discussed. But I also want to emphasize that right now there's no Plan B. There is a new legislature in session than had passed the previous, or passed this road funding package. But there's maybe some hope there if we are looking for a solution. But right now there's no Plan B. I think you all have in your hands one of our documents that's a CRC memorandum. That's a short analysis that's somewhat similar to what I talked about today. We have a 25-page paper that goes into things much more in depth for those who are interested, a little bit of history about some of this stuff, more information about where all this money is going, where it will go, how much money will go where, more information about the formula used to calculate the fuel tax, all that stuff. All our information is always available for free on our website at crcmich.org.